In 1971, a donut shop in California was robbed and the young woman working the counter was also abducted. She would later be found sexually assaulted and strangled. Then it happened again in Salt Lake City, Utah. That clerk was only 17 and her body would later be found having been shot to death. The same crime would continue happening throughout the United States. Texas, Florida, Colorado, Kansas, nowhere was safe. The killers would terrorize clerks at small shops for over a year before getting caught. This is Monsters. On an otherwise quiet Friday afternoon in June of 1972 at around 4:45, Carl Taylor pulled his red Toyota around the back of a Giordano's supermarket located on State Street in Santa Barbara, California. He'd done this kind of thing countless times before, of course, but rarely alone, and so for that reason he was a little nervous. Still, he'd come too far to not follow through with the plan now, so as he got out of the car, he made sure to leave it running before making his way over to the supermarket. Once he entered, he pulled out his gun and had the manager empty the safe for a haul of $1,850. The only problem was, this would be the final robbery he'd ever commit, as just a couple of days later on June 24th, police captured him and formally charged him with the crime. Over the course of the subsequent interviews he gave, it would become apparent that this wasn't even close to the worst he'd done. No, he and his family were also the ones responsible for what would later become known as the Donut Shop murders. Born in Greenville, Texas on April 7, 1938, Carl Taylor always struggled with his confidence while he was growing up, with one of the main reasons being his hair lip and large ears, which regularly caused kids at school to bully him by referring to him as Rabbit. As if that wasn't bad enough, he also had a tight foreskin which, as he got older, made any attempt at sexual activity particularly painful. Sure, these issues could have been resolved with corrective surgery, but with Carl's mother being either uninformed or indifferent to the matter, she ultimately chose not to go down that route. But that wasn't the only thing making Carl's early days difficult, as there was also the fact he could never settle in one place for long enough to establish any roots. By the time he was 14 years old, his parents had already moved him around Texas to a variety of new places such as San Antonio, Houston, Galveston, Wichita Falls, Athens, and Terrell. Perhaps that's why, as his teenage years blossomed, he started acting out in ways that usually centered around violence, with one of the most prominent examples taking place when he was in 7th grade. Basically, after apparently having had enough of a particular classmate picking on him, he pulled out a knife and threatened to stab him. That action led to expulsion and an early entry into the adult world of full-time work, with Carl's first job being in a trailer manufacturing facility where, after his stepfather took his first paycheck, he fled home and got as far as Cincinnati before being found again by police. Obviously, he didn't want to be around his family anymore as he felt they were doing him no good, but it had been that way for years, no matter which new stepfather his mother brought home for him to meet. Realizing her son needed someone else who could raise him, she sent the youngster over to her brother in Houston, where he was expected to stay indefinitely. Unfortunately, though, while that was a better environment, it did nothing to stop Carl's descent into a life of petty crime, as almost immediately upon arriving in Houston, he stole a checkbook from someone and began writing bogus checks in his name. That would continue to be a way of life for him for the foreseeable future because, even if he did occasionally get arrested, it was an easy way to make money in the long run, so as far as he was concerned, it was worth the overall risk. That's not to say he didn't have occasional attempts to turn his life around in a more meaningful direction, such as when he briefly enlisted in the army when he was 17. The only problem with that was he was unable to adapt to necessary military discipline, and so, after serving only 1 year, he was gone and back to running his money frauds in order to get by. It was a pattern the Greenville native couldn't seem to break, and the same reckless abandon also colored his love life too, because between 1955 and 1969, he had a series of bigamous marriages with women all over the country who ended up fathering him at least 4 children. While he was doing that, he was also still frequently getting arrested, with him at one point serving 7.5 years behind bars in Washington State Prison in Walla Walla, Washington. As far as the romantic aspect of Carl's life, that would at least start to settle down during the latter year, as it was then he first met Ginger McCrary. With Ginger also came a connection to the man who would go on to become his main partner in crime, Sherman McCrary. Sherman McCrary was the father of Ginger, someone who felt he'd come a long way since youth, which was spent working the cotton fields of Byers, Oklahoma during the late 1920s and into the 30s. Sure, he'd never been a man to hold down a real job, and, like his new son-in-law, his pattern of getting into trouble at school had followed him all the way through the military and into adult life. But at least he was free and happy, and that was the most important thing for a nomadic man like him. He was even able to keep him and his family, a family that also included his wife Carolyn and his son Danny, going via his own path of petty criminal activity. Now seeing an in-law who he could partner up with, he felt all the more emboldened to ramp things up a notch. Not in terms of a big score, of course. No, Sherman never really seemed to have the savvy to get something like that set up. Rather, he preferred to go after small targets, places such as local diners and supermarkets. Was a donut shop in California they chose to hit on August 20th, 1971 the first place of that kind they ever robbed? Unlikely, but it's the one that took things to another level altogether. Basically, it began when the pair entered the shop in question and were greeted by the young girl on shift, Leora Looney. According to Carl's own testimony, which should be taken with a grain of salt, he had no idea they were even going to rob the place at the time. No, he believed Sherman had actually managed to get a score from the liquor store he'd visited earlier, but after apparently finding it to be too busy there, Sherman had instead decided the best thing to do was to go for somewhere quieter. That somewhere was where they sat right then, a small little donut shop in the middle of nowhere with hardly any foot traffic passing by. Clearly, the money accrued from such a job would be minimal, perhaps not even worth the risk at all, but at least one of the men that night had other prizes in mind. After announcing their presence and emptying the tills, the two left with Leora as a hostage. Now again, the person responsible for this differs depending on whose version of the story you're listening to. To hear Carl describe it, he didn't even know his partner in crime had taken the girl until he was outside running towards the car. Meanwhile, as Sherman explained it, the kidnapping of Sherry and what subsequently happened to her was all the plan of his companion. Either way, the reality was the same. The defenseless young woman was now stuck in the backseat of a car with 2 criminals who were more than willing to do her harm should the need arise. And do her harm they most certainly did, because after deciding she was too much of a liability to remain alive, they drove out to the remote desert of Nevada, where one or possibly both of the men tied her arms up with a pair of pantyhose, wrapped her up in a blanket, and shot her 4 times, killing her. An interesting thing to note, however, is that, back at home, Ginger and her mother Carolyn weren't entirely oblivious to what was taking place, a fact that would become important later on down the line. Of course, they knew all too well what their men did in order to earn money. That said, they were also well aware a kidnapping had taken place that evening because, in the words of Carl himself, quote, Ginger knew that she was in the car because we had taken and went by the house and Sherman left the money there. I didn't think he was intending to kill the girl because Liz and Ginger both knew she was in the damn car. So, while the girls might not have exactly been expecting a murder to take place, they were at least okay with someone being held against their will. That's perhaps what made it easier for Carl and Sherman to continue on in that manner, with the next known incident taking place just 1 week later at the Mr. Donut shop in Lakewood, Colorado. This time, the victim would be 20-year-old Leora Looney, a popular young woman from the local area who'd spent the prior few months saving up to go on a trip to surprise her boyfriend down in Kansas for his birthday. Sadly, though, she'd never make it to Kansas because at around 9:30 p.m., a white 4-door Ford Galaxy with Nebraska license plates pulled up in the parking lot and 2 men got out of the car. This was the night her life would end too, because Carl and Sherman were heading towards her workplace. When they got inside, it didn't take long for them to rattle through the cash registers, then leave once more with an innocent girl in tow. Again, the take there was small, so small that it seemed like a very poor plan for a crime. That would later lead some to wonder if there wasn't an aspect of the women the pair saw as additional payment, a nice bonus for themselves to enjoy before they returned home to their wives. If that's true, it's unlikely it was the case with Carl as, on account of his medical history, he probably wasn't going to take part in any acts of sexual assault, but Sherman certainly had no such qualms. No, this time after stuffing the terrified young girl in the back seat of the car, then tying her up, he would repeatedly have his way with her, all while Carl allegedly watched from the front seat in disgust. Once it was over and done with and the older of the pair was satisfied, he instructed Carl to drive back down the I-85 and pull over somewhere off the side of the road before Cheyenne. He reasoned that at this time of night it was dark and quiet there, so the chances of anyone seeing them doing anything were minimal. At least that's what they thought though, because after they settled on a spot about 6 miles north of the Rockport Tavern, someone apparently did see something from the distance as Carl pulled over and opened the rear seat door, only for Leora to then attempt one last desperate gasp at making an escape when she bolted out of the vehicle and ran for her life. Unfortunately for her, however, by that point, Sherman had already tied a noose around her neck, and so she didn't get very far before she was stopped and there, right amongst the grass and weeds, was shot repeatedly until she was dead. Now, to hear Carl tell it, that incident was a step too far for even him and so disgusting to his morals that he vowed never to take part in another crime with his father-in-law again. As we know now, though, that would not be how things played out, and in a twist to the story, it appears the two men may not have been the only ones involved. It turns out that the lone witness mentioned a moment ago reported seeing 3 figures on that night, one of whom had red hair. Given the fact that Ginger's name matched her locks, police would later use that as evidence to push the idea that both her and maybe even her mother had been directly involved in at least that particular killing. That's right, the women may not have been as separated from everything going on as they seemed. Though it should be noted this was one witness sighting taken from a far-off location at night, and so it shouldn't necessarily be treated as gospel. Either way, though, whether she was directly involved in this murder or not, Ginger must have at least assumed something suspicious was afoot when her husband and father returned home a few hours later. And she wasn't the only person who was likely aware that a very serious crime had taken place, because the next morning when the early staff showed up at the Mr. Doughnut store and found not only Leora Looney missing, but everything still open, they immediately knew something was wrong. That was why they called the police and had them come over to look into what they feared might be a kidnapping or even worse. Once the police got there and figured out the lay of the land, they agreed it didn't look good. The first officer on the scene, James Odell, pretty quickly understood the potential severity of the situation. So once his partner, AIC James Wayneck, arrived soon after, they began contacting the family and friends of the girl to see if she'd been seen by them recently. Of course, she hadn't been seen, though. No, she had never returned home at all the prior evening, and while police would learn from her sister Joyce that she did have plans to go visit her boyfriend in Kansas, that wasn't supposed to happen for another week. Thankfully, though, the disappearance wouldn't be a complete mystery for long as, after starting a formal investigation, police came into contact with Michael Ray Seeley, a man who said he'd been in the donut shop on the night of the disappearance and had information that might be of some use to them. He explained that, upon arrival at around 9:40 p.m., he saw 2 suspicious-looking men sitting at the far end of the building, one heavy-set and the other with a dark complexion. According to Michael, each of the men appeared to know each other, but neither was talking, almost as if they were planning something. Sure, this might seem incredibly circumstantial, but when combined with the testimony of Alexander Kilpatrick, another customer of the Mr. Doughnut shop that night, it started to provide an image that these 2 mysterious figures may have indeed had some involvement in the crime. As Alexander put it, when he and his wife arrived, 2 men matching the same description were sitting contemplating something. Of course, initially he brushed them off and went on to the till to make his order, something Leora happily gathered and rang up for him. Once his wife had paid for their items, the couple headed back towards the door, only for him to stop at the last minute and ask the young waitress if he could have a glass of water. When he did, though, he noticed one of the strange men standing up and looking at him, almost as if he was sizing him up to try to figure out who he was. He appeared to be nervous, something Alexander took note of as he quickly drank his water and made his exit. But that wasn't the end of what Alexander Kilpatrick noticed before leaving the donut shop that night. Once he and his wife got back outside, he claimed to see two women approaching from across the street. One with red hair and the other who looked older than her, like she was her mother. While at the time that meant little to the investigation team, later on it would be further evidence that Ginger and Carolyn had a more direct involvement in the murders than was immediately apparent. Any hope of tracking down the foursome in Colorado wouldn't be worth much though, because, perhaps realizing they needed to get out of town and let the heat die down for a while, Carl and Sherman had left the state together with their wives. Not that that would mark the end of their crime spree, though. No, they still had to make ends meet, and the only way they knew how to do so was to rob places. That's what led them to committing another murder on September 28th of 1970 when they robbed a Hobnob truck stop and took a young waitress named Elizabeth Perryman with them as a trophy. It's reasonable to say the girl was a trophy at this point, as the money they'd gotten from the heist was so minimal it may as well have not existed at all. In the end, $125 was the total take for the night, making it seem all the more tragic that someone had to die over it. But if the killers had any second thoughts about what they were doing following such a pointless murder, it certainly didn't show itself in their actions. They had actually stepped things up a level when, sometime in 1971, Sherman decided to formally bring his son Danny onto their crew. Was Carl aware of that at first? That's unclear. In fact, there is some evidence to suggest that for the first half of the year, many of the crimes that have been attributed to Carl and Sherman may have been the work of the father and son team alone. But why wouldn't Carl be involved in those crimes? Well, according to him, he'd been trying to break away from the family for some time and go straight once more, with him at one point even moving Ginger and their 3 kids over to his mother's house in nearby Athens, where he hoped to find honest work on a ranch. Again though, given the untrustworthiness of Carl's testimony when it comes to details that shine him in a better light than his friends, such statements shouldn't be taken as fact. Sure, he did move his family over to Athens, Texas at one point in early 1971, but an alternative reason for that could have just as easily been he was simply waiting for the heat to die down on a series of recent robberies before he ventured back out into his life of crime. Whatever the truth, he didn't stay away from Sherman for too long, because come January of the following year, the whole family would be reunited once more in Dallas, somewhere Carl was hesitant to return to at first as he'd already written a series of bad checks there in the past. But return he did, and it was there that, with the constant need for money looming, he quickly reconvened his work with his father-in-law. While their earlier murders in Colorado and California were bad enough, now that they were in Texas, it presented an all-new level of risk. The reason for that was because Texas state law still allowed for the death penalty. Sure, capital punishment was still technically active in both the Golden State and the Centennial State, but instances of people being put to death there were exceedingly rare at that point. Not so much in Texas, however, where the rate of executions were higher than anywhere else in the country. It was something that Carl was well aware of, so much so that, at least initially, he tried to make ends meet with the far less severe crime of cashing fraudulent checks, which had worked out so well for him once upon a time in his youth. That would ultimately change when on a ride with Sherman and Danny on the night of October 17th, they spotted a Mr. M store in the near distance, and the patriarch of the clan decided it would be a good opportunity for his son to make a quick score. The only problem was, once they pulled into the parking lot, they discovered it wasn't just Jenna Covey, the 19-year-old mother of 2 who was behind the counter. No, also in the building was her 22-year-old husband, Forrest. The reason he was there at that particular point was because he'd brought an evening meal for his wife to eat, then he was planning on helping her close up the store for the night. Of course, they never got to close up the store because before they could, their lives would be snuffed out and their bodies would be dumped about 40 miles east of Mesquite. Interestingly, though, this time when they were discovered, the police found no evidence that Jenna had been sexually assaulted in any way. Was that because Danny was with the killers this time? Who knows, but it's as good an explanation as any. Whatever their reason for their restraint this time, it wasn't as if they had a big haul to take away, because the money looted from the till would be even less than what was taken from the Elizabeth Perryman murder. That's right, for the deaths of 2 people, the trio earned only $100 between them. That meant they had to keep hitting locations and taking hostages each time they did, with the whole thing now turning into a complete perpetual motion machine of chaos and destruction that had no end. That's what led to another murder happening just 3 days later on October 20th, when all 3 men hit a sweet cream donut shop and this time killed a 16-year-old girl named Susan Darlene Shaw. Interestingly though, when later questioned about the incident, both Carl and Sherman would be hesitant to discuss the details. It's unclear why, but likely because Danny played a bigger role than usual, and so talking about his involvement might incriminate him in a way they didn't want to. On top of that, it's also highly possible both Ginger and Carolyn played a more direct role in that particular crime too, as, once again, when the young girl's body was later found in a nearby river, a witness came forward to say he'd remembered seeing a woman with red hair acting suspiciously in that area only a few hours before. Even that wasn't the end of the mystery surrounding the Elizabeth Perryman murder, because while one of the few details Carl gave about the incident was that the girl had died within hours of being taken, a later autopsy suggested she had actually passed away on October 23rd instead, a full 3 days after the initial robbery. So why was there a time discrepancy? Was there something more horrific that had happened to Elizabeth during this 3-day period the Taylor McCrary family were so scared of talking about? It seems that might be the case, and it suggests all 5 involved had now begun graduating to even more unforgivable acts than they had been taking part in before. That said, this new direction may have also been the point Carl legitimately felt things were going too far, because afterwards, he insisted they all get out of town and move down to Tampa for a while where they could lay low. It was while there that he made another attempt to change their path by trying to pick up his old check fraud scheme once more, and use that as a way to make money instead of robbery and murder. It appears this new path didn't last very long, as on July 27, 1971, another young girl named Deborah Lynn Boyd went missing from a Handy Andy curb store in Albany, Georgia. Sure, it may seem like a stretch to blame this disappearance on the Taylor McCrarys, but given it was so similar to the other crimes they had committed, and given the fact that they could have easily driven to Georgia and back in that time frame if they were desperate enough to make a quick score, then it's entirely possible they were the perpetrators. It wasn't like they weren't able to get as far as Chattanooga during that time period, as bad checks in the area would later confirm. And it wasn't like they weren't still committing murders closer to home as well, as on November 30th, in a robbery of a Nell's beauty shop which earned them a total of $12, they kidnapped and killed 22-year-old Patricia Marr, 38-year-old Bobby Turner, and 16-year-old Valerie Turner, all in short order. Even that wasn't the end of their ongoing spree though, because on February 19, 1972, a 26-year-old girl working at a local get-and-go market named Cynthia Ann Glass was also kidnapped and killed after Sherman entered the store late in the evening to buy a pack of cigarettes. By now, whether Carl or Sherman knew it at the time or not, their wave of crime was soon to come to an end. After later going through the receipts at the get-and-go market where Cynthia had been taken, and then questioning people who'd been in the area at the time, police were able to get a vague idea of the kind of person or persons who might have been committing this string of murders at last. While their detective work would have likely led them to tracking down the perpetrators sooner rather than later at that point, in the end they didn't have to because the situation came to a close before they could do so. On June 1st of that year, after Carl, Sherman, and Danny had hit a series of supermarkets between Kansas and California, the former decided to go out on his own for the next job. While the reason he chose to do so remains unclear, one possible explanation could be that he was once more trying to break away from the family and set both he and Ginger up for a life on their own. When later asked about it by police, however, he seemed to deny such a reasoning. As he would state then, he'd actually asked Sherman to come along with him for his next job, only for his father-in-law to inform him he simply wasn't interested in it. While that would be Carl's official word on the matter, again, these words have to be taken with a grain of salt, as the idea Sherman wouldn't want to take part in a potentially big money-making heist seems unlikely. Whatever the truth, the end result was the same. At around 4:30 p.m. that afternoon, Carl pulled into the parking lot of a Giordano's supermarket just off State Street, left his engine running for a quick getaway, then got out and walked towards the store. Unfortunately, though, when he entered a few seconds after that, he was met with aisles full of customers. More than he'd planned on being there. Still, he'd committed to the act, so he felt compelled to go ahead with the next step anyway. That next step was to find both the manager and assistant manager, who he then told to take him to the safe, otherwise he was going to shoot them both. Of course, when confronted with that reality, each man played along and immediately took Carl to the office where the safe was. Much to the robber's dismay, though, once the safe was opened, he realized it was nearly empty, so panicking, he told the pair to go out to the tills and start emptying them too, something which instantly alerted the customers in the store to the fact something was wrong. That proved to be Carl's big mistake, because it appears someone was able to get out and make a call to the police before he could notice, meaning there was now a ticking timer on how quickly he had to get out of there. Obviously, he could have just bailed entirely, but seeing all the tills almost emptied, he felt compelled to stay for a couple more minutes. It was that couple of minutes that made the difference, as by the time Carl was making his way back through the parking lot, an officer rounded the corner, saw him standing there, and pulled out a shotgun. That was when the Santa Barbara shootout began, a shootout that led to Carl shooting and almost killing a cop, then having to hijack another vehicle when it became apparent a Good Samaritan had turned his engine off while he was in the store and placed his keys away in a safe place he was unable to locate in his now panicked state. He was able to escape in spite of that and make it back to the Taylor McCrary home, where he hoped to lay low for a while. The only problem was, unlike other times when he and Sherman had been hiding out after a job, this time it was an officer of the law who had been shot. And to make matters worse, that cop just so happened to be the son-in-law of Carl's landlord, meaning he was able to positively identify him after the fact. Needless to say, it didn't take long for authorities to track him down after that. When they did, a subsequent search of the house would lead to Sherman, Carolyn, and Danny McCrary being arrested after a treasure trove of disguises and illegal weapons was discovered. The only people who weren't arrested at that point on Friday, June 23rd, in fact, were Ginger and Carl themselves, with the reason being that they were in Athens at the time. But it didn't take long for police to track them down either, and so by the end of the day, they'd be in custody as well. Of course, what the arresting officers at the time didn't realize was that they also had the culprits behind a wave of murders which had been going on across the western half of the country for at least 2 years now. So, perhaps realizing his goose was about to be cooked, Carl decided to tell all, and pretty quickly it allowed the process of formally charging the family with their crimes to begin. Well, at least it would be for 4 of them, because, try as they might, the investigators could find no solid evidence to link Ginger to what had taken place. Though Ginger herself would later get 3 years behind bars for the lesser charge of passing bad checks. In the end, while Danny was being tried separately in Texas and ultimately convicted of the murder of Forrest and Gina Covey there, Carl, Sherman, and Carolyn would all have their trials take place in the state of Colorado. That had been the location of the Leora Looney murder, and local police who wanted justice for that were able to convince the trio that there was far less chance they'd get the death penalty in Colorado. So that was how the courts were first able to convict Carolyn McCrary on March 28, 1973, after she pled guilty to being an accessory to murder after the fact. It was also how they were able to convict Sherman McCrary of kidnapping and first-degree murder just 1 month later on April 23rd. In the case of Carl Taylor, though, despite his prior confession, things would not go quite as simply as, seemingly out of nowhere, he attempted to plead not guilty through reason of insanity. That meant his trial would have to be delayed as a court-ordered psychiatrist was brought in to assess him. Did he actually think this plan would work in getting him off? It's unlikely, and far more probable he was just buying himself as much time as possible before the inevitable occurred. Either way, that inevitability finally came for him anyway when he was deemed sane and, like his father-in-law Sherman, he was also sentenced to life in prison. Just like that, the murder spree of the Taylor McCrary family came to an end and the victims were able to start thinking about rebuilding their lives. Something many of them did together because in the years following, many would discover each other online and form a support group of sorts. Since then, while Ginger, Carolyn, and Danny have all since been released, Carl Taylor remains behind bars, with him now being in his 80s and unlikely to ever see freedom again. As for Sherman McCrary, well, he certainly won't see freedom again, as he took his own life in prison in 1988 at the age of 61. In the end, even if a lot of people had to die senselessly, at the very least, justice was served. And given that's not always a guarantee in situations like this, some solace can be taken in that fact. Thanks for watching This Is Monsters. New episodes are uploaded twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays. There are occasional bonus episodes covering unsolved cases and criminal history. If you have a suggestion for a case you think I should cover, leave it in the comments. You can always follow the channel on Instagram at thisis_monsters and purchase merch at thisismonsters.com. Thanks so much, and be safe.